welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and I'm here today with my usual co host, Anthony Marquetta, and our guest, Jim Breyfogle. Mr. Breyfogle, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Always a pleasure. We've had you on before for your different Mongoose and Meerkat book releases, Kickstarters, and you've in general been one of what is it? Uh, one of Kersoba's stable of authors, uh, who produces, a book. I want to say a bit better than every year, which is very nice. Um, Today, you released the Pass of Commonor and the Mongoose and Meerkat, and let me see. And now we have a new Kickstarter for your book, A Bad Case of Dead. Am I missing anything?
No, no, that pretty much covers it. Yeah.
Excellent. Uh, so why don't you take us down the path of A Bad Case of Dead and tell us about it?
Okay. Well, A Bad Case of Dead is it's a standalone no standalone novel because three of the things that you mentioned are all linked together, the three volumes of the Mongoose and Meerkat. So this is
Yes.
not one of the Mongoose and Meerkat stories, and it's not in the Paths of Core Manor universe either. It is rather loosely set in our own universe. Starts out in London in the year 1846 with a guy from Cornwall who has left Cornwall and wanted to make his way in the world. Uh, his original intent, I mean, if you know 1846 in the British Empire and the sun never sets on the British Empire. He has a girl back in Cornwall that he would like to be able to marry, but he needs to make his fortune. So his original intent is to go from Cornwall to London, out somewhere into the wide world, make his fortune, and then he can come back and marry the girl that he loves. But it doesn't work out that way, of course, because there wouldn't be a story in that. He gets as far as London, and it turns out that the girl has followed him, and he kind of gets cold feet and he doesn't really trust the people in London that if he were to leave the wide world that she would still be available when he gets back. So he kind of gets stuck in London and he gets a job as a clerk in a colliery and she gets a job as a governess and it's just sort of a static situation when the story ends is that they're both in London and he has ambitions but he also has fears and he needs something to kind of kick him out of this static existence. But what happens is not at all what he expected. One of his lunch hours, he goes to visit her, and he's late. And 1846. This is the bosses don't have to be nice, so he knows that if he is late getting back to work, he will be fired. And so it pushes him to take a shortcut through one of the back alleys of London. And if you can think of a back alley in London, it's this sort of dark, foreboding, nasty place. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you're on the right track. And if you can picture an alley like that right behind a store that sells kind of like dark magic, you would think that that's maybe not the alley that you want to cut through. And you would be right, but he doesn't have much choice. So he ends up cutting through this alley, and his timing is very bad. And he runs into a creature that he's not familiar with, and there's a little bit of a scuffle, and the creature scratches him, and he continues on, makes it to work just barely on time, goes through the rest of his day, meets up with his friends, and is not feeling well. Wakes up the next morning, and he's dead. Um, and not in the corpse laying on the bed sort of way. It's the I'm getting up and I don't feel well and I don't know why I don't feel well way. And then when he goes to a neighbor who happens to be an apothecary because he's like, hey, I'm not feeling well, can you help me out? Then his neighbor looks at him and says, you've caught what is no is known as dead. And you actually are dead. You're not breathing, your heart's not beating, you sort of feel normal, if a little bit unwell, but you will degrade. You are basically a walking zombie. They don't use that term, but
Yeah.
is what it is. And over time, you will get worse and worse and worse. You will lose your mind. You will become angry. You will become hungry. You will become violent until you are a complete beast, and you will have to be destroyed. And there's nothing we can do about it. Sorry. And he's like, there has to. I mean, if this is a magical sort of thing, there has to be a way you can fix me. And the apothecary says, well, the problem is we don't like magical things, and all these fairy tales that you used to hear about, we've driven them out of the wide world. The pixies and the giants and all these things that the Pook of Bucks Hill and that sort of thing. They're not around here anymore. And the only thing that might save you would be a necromancer. And necromancers make bad neighbors. And so if you want to find a necromancer, you won't find one in the wide world, you find one in the narrow world. And the narrow world is an archipelago that's sort of half in our world and half not in our world. So you'd have to find somebody who could sail you through space and magic to reach the narrow world. And in the narrow world, you'd have to find a necromancer and convince him to work to help you. And that might not be possible, but it's the only hope you have. So he gives him a kind of magical elixir which will slow down the progression of dead. And he says, this is really, really bad luck for you because it shouldn't have happened in London at all. It shouldn't have happened to you. But the one thing that is good luck for you is trips to the narrow world. Ships that sail there are very rare, but there is one leaving. Oh, look, an hour. You better leave now. And so he has, literally minutes to pack his bags and get down to the docks and convince the ship that they should give him passage to the narrow world, which he leaves him absolutely no time to talk to his girlfriend, no time to make any other arrangements or anything like that. He just has to grab his stuff and go and get on board and somehow make it to the narrow world without letting anybody know that he's dead. Because if they know that he's dead, they'll kill him for real. They'll do the, cut off the heads, burn the body, stake through the heart, all that sort of thing. And then once he's in the narrow world, he needs to find somewhere in this vast region of archipelago of islands. He needs to find a necromancer, and then necromancers are notoriously cranky people. He needs to convince the necromancer to help him. And the story is from when he leaves his girlfriend's place of work at lunchtime until he reaches the end of the quest, which I won't give you the spoiler of that actual point, but
Sure. So yeah.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good start. I like it. I'm intrigued. Anthony, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm here. No, I'm kidding.
All right. Thank you, Anthony.
Hi.
Very good. See you next week.
No, actually, I did have a question, though. I'm intrigued by the idea. Sure. As I told Ben before this, I am happy to say that since the last time we've had you on, I have read one of your books, and I enjoyed it very much. So I am intrigued by this premise. Passive Corminor, by the way. So I'm intrigued by this premise. I'm curious. So the state of being dead, is this? I'm going to use a TV tropes term, but to be honest, I'm not using it because it's TV tropes. I'm using it because it's the best term I could think of to describe this phenomenon. But is this like a cursed by the awesome thing? Like, does our protagonist have any special powers as a result of being dead, or would you rather not spoil that?
Oh no, it's fine. I don't mind talking about that. And first of all, thank you for reading Passive Core Manor. I'm glad you enjoyed it. But our protagonist's name is Edward Truscott, and it's neither here nor there. But as I'm writing the book, the entire time the working title is Dead Ed, and so if I call him Dead Ed, I'm just slipping back into flippant way of referring to the character. So,
yeah, still a pretty good name,
yeah. So Ed really he doesn't have what you would consider any special powers per se. He's marginally stronger than he was before. He's not supernaturally strong, but he does have a little bit of strength that he wouldn't have gotten just by clerking at a colliery. Any other advantage that he might have comes from actually being dead. So like he doesn't need to breathe,
Yeah, that's what I was
and it's
thinking.
not that
Like,
that
is it the sort of thing where it's like, you stab him in the middle of a fight and he just keeps fighting, and you're like, wow, that normally would have killed someone.
Okay, so it's funny you mentioned that because I was gonna at some point I was gonna maybe talk about this scene because it's one of my favorite scenes in the book and it's exactly what you're talking about is he and his
Mm,
guide are on one of the islands and they get his guide more than he does gets caught by a siren who draws her in and scrolls her so she's basically standing there helpless as this old ancient sorceress is going to do whatever she does. And Edward comes along and he's protected a little bit because, he's dead. And the siren's call is all the good things that can happen in your life. And since he's dead, it feels more distant and not as compelling to him. And what the sorceress is going to do because she is so ancient, the way she has kept her vitality and her life going, and she has a magic dagger that she stabs people, and it transfers the life from that person into her. So she's going to stab the guide, and Edward comes and is going to rescue him, and then there's a fight, and she stabs him instead. And of course, as you anticipated, it doesn't do anything to him because he's already dead. Not only can't she draw his life from him, but it doesn't knock him over. And so it allows him to kill her. And this is a minor spoiler, which is why I don't mind giving it to him. And it's
mm,
only a spoiler insofar as the problem this creates for him, because I mean the dead gave him the ability to survive this stabbing in the chest, but it created a problem for him because if they ever find the necromancer and the necromancer brings him back to life, now he's got a hole right through his chest, right into his heart, and that will kill him again. And
Right.
so
that's a
now he
cool
had,
idea. It
and so
reminds me
now,
of oh, finish what you're saying
oh,
first.
I was just going to say, and so now, even though I've given you a spoiler on one of the things, it gives him another problem because he's dead. He can't heal. There's nothing they can do about that hole in his heart as long as he's dead. So now he's in a catch-22. So that fact that he's dead has enabled him to survive one obstacle, but it has also created another obstacle that he didn't have at the beginning of that scene.
Right.
Hmm.
I like
Yeah,
it.
it reminds me of one of my favorite scenes in one of my favorite movies in the climax to Pirates of the Caribbean. How they end up killing Barbosa.
Yes.
Jack shoots him in the chest, and then they drop the coins in, and Barbosa, it's like you wasted your shot. But after they drop the coin in, and he's no longer undead, then the bullet that is in his chest kills him. Uh,
Yes.
it's a very clever scene, a very clever movie, and it reminds me of that. So it's a cool idea. It's nice to see, like, when you have a unique premise like this, guy who's undead who needs to get it undone. What you're looking for, I think, if you're a reader, is you want to see how the author really plays with the premise, because it's like, what are you bringing to the table with this very interesting new idea that isn't normally done, right? Like, that
Yep.
I wouldn't normally see. And this concept of, okay, but if he comes back to life with a huge wound in his chest, it will just kill him again immediately, is an interesting idea.
So and that it plays into, I mean, from the point of view of an author, what you want to do is make things harder for your character. Because the harder it is for the character, it is more interesting for the reader to, how are they going to, oh my God, this is so hard. How are they going to solve it? And it's like, oh my gosh, this is even worse. How are they going to solve that? So it does a couple of things because obviously you have a huge problem right now is you've got to figure out a way to heal dead tissue, which theoretically isn't possible. So you have to figure out how to do the impossible. But you also, because the entire book has this ticking clock going on, is if Edward does not find a cure fast enough, the elixir can only work for so long. Sooner or later, he will be that mindless, flesh eating beast that needs to be put down. And if you're, off on the side quest of trying to heal dead flesh so that your main quest can actually go forward, that clock is still ticking. So whatever time they take trying to figure out how to heal that hole in his chest only makes it worse because they have less time to figure out, how to get to the necromancer and convince him to help Edward.
Yeah, it's cool to see when you're right that an author's best friend. This is like a tried and true technique. You learn it very early on if you're any sort of writer. Is that adding a time clock is a fantastic way of increasing the tension.
Oh yeah.
Right. It's simple. It's easy. It's very, and it is very very effective. Uh, to the point where it can sometimes cover up, I think, for things. I remember reading a book by Madeline L'Engle, who's the Wrinkle in Time author.
Mm-hmm.
She has
Yep.
it's a 5-book series, or four or five, depending on how you count it, right? And one of the books is called Many Waters.
Mm-hmm.
And Many Waters, I don't know if you've read it or not, but it's a fine book. It's not bad. It's not great. Uh, and it's about the two twins in the family of the Murray family are sent back in time to right before Noah's flood. And Noah's flood, this is an excellent idea because Noah's flood creates a time clock, right? And
Right.
Wrangle is very clever in the way that she utilizes this as well, because you know that the twins are going to make it back. I mean, they pretty much tell you as well pretty early on, but you also know the story of Noah's flood, and there is a character who is introduced who's kind of a love interest for the twins, who is not mentioned in the Bible story, right? Which means presumably she's not going to survive the flood. So it's a great little way of adding tension to a story that otherwise uh, doesn't have it. It's a very tried and true authorial method for increasing suspense. Just
Oh
stick a
yeah.
date and then go. If it's
Just,
not
just,
done by this, then you
yep.
lose.
But yeah, and it's a natural one. I mean, especially for a book like this one, it feels natural because you have what is basically a disease, and diseases progress. And if you don't cure the disease before it progresses too far, then you have consequences. Whether you get sicker or you die. So it doesn't. As I'm writing the book, it did not feel like an artificial clock that I'm inserting here. It felt like a very natural one, and it's a good one too, because as a disease, you see the progression of the disease going forward. It's not like the the timer on a bomb where everything is normal until suddenly you have a huge explosion. This sort of ticking clock causes problems for Edward as he goes forward, because when he makes it into the narrow world, he's able to find help. And the initial help that he finds is not a necromancer, but somebody who can help guide him through the archipelago to find the necromancer. And the guide that I mentioned, who was going to be killed for her life, um, she's there not just to guide him, though, but if the disease progresses too far, it gets to the point where you can't do anything to help him, then she'll be the one who kills him. I mean, you got to keep an eye on your guide sometimes. Um, so so he knows that she will only help him to a certain point. And as the disease progresses, you start to worry and wonder, because I mean, one of the symptoms as it gets further and further and closer to this, violent, mindless zombie thing is he loses control of his anger. So as he as he gets angry, he needs to worry about, am I getting angry because this is a frustrating situation where anybody would get angry? Or am I getting angry because the dead is making my anger stronger and amplifying it, and I shouldn't get angry at this point, and I need to be worried about this anger? So that becomes a question in his mind, and overlaying that becomes the question of, how does she see it? Even if this is a natural anger, if she sees it as a supernatural anger, she might kill me. So the ticking clock and the
So
progression of the disease becomes not just, the time bomb sort of things. It becomes a contributing driver to his problems.
Nice. It's always good to see stuff like that because it
I
helps.
have another question.
Yeah.
Finish your thought, Ben.
It's always good to see stuff like that because it adds depth of characterization. The question of am I responding to these stimuli right is sometimes, well, many times authors just ignore it. They straight up ignore it. We see it all the time with a lot of fiction where it's like a character blows up in somebody's face for basically no reason, or even because for very bad reasons. And it's very much like, hey, you need to sit down and think about it, and then come back to figuring out whether or not you have a right to be angry or whether you should just kind of let bygones be bygones.
Yeah, I had a question about tone of the book. So when I heard the idea and the title and things like that, it got me to wondering, like, so how seriously am I going to be taking everything that's going on in this book? Like, is there a comedic edge to it, or is it should I be assuming, or at least would I as the reader figure that everything is probably going to end well, or is this a darker sort of story?
Um, yeah, that's a good question, especially with a title like A Bad Case of Dead, which sounds pretty flippant. Um, you should probably take it seriously. There's certain aspects of it that are I don't want to say lighthearted or anything like that, but even in the darkest situations, people will crack a joke or they'll find humor in a black sort of humor sort of thing. Um, but it is not intended to be a comedy. Um, Dead is capitalized pretty much throughout the book because it is the proper name of the disease that he has. It's not just the state that he's in; it's the disease of the name of that he has. So you wouldn't think of a book that was titled "A Bad Case of Cancer" would be funny. And that's kind of the equivalent of what this is. It's yeah. So it's also kind of interesting because this is 1846 England, and it starts out in London, and the book starts and it sets the tone. I think if you get into it at some point, you'll recognize pretty quickly that it's not a comic book, and it sets the tone, and you have smaller situations because it's the beginning of the book, and then it grows into larger situations. Um, but they're not particularly funny. The consequences are real. If Edward doesn't return to his job before the clock strikes the hour, he'll be fired. And if he's fired, then he doesn't know what he'll do because he's barely making enough money. I mean, he's making enough money to make ends meet and he can go out to the pub, but he's not making enough money to get married. So there's real consequences for something as minor as being a minute late for work, and that sort of um, I think that sets the tone for the book that all these actions have results and the consequences aren't all good. I don't want to tell you if the ending is good, bad, or indifferent, but I will in general terms anyway. Is I don't personally um, view it as an unhappy ending. I view it more as a mixed ending. Um, so the book would not support a comic ending um, because it's not a comic book. And I think as you read through, hopefully my goal when I was writing it was to draw the reader into two different directions regarding what they expected for Edward at the end of the book. And so that when they get to the ending of the book and they see how it's resolved, hopefully they'll be okay with it. Um, but if you've read The Mongoose and Meerkat, or if you've read The Paths of Core Manor, you know that I'm not guaranteeing an ending of one sort or the other because I'm perfectly happy to write um, endings that are bittersweet as well as endings that are a little happier.
Yeah, and that's perfectly fine. Partially because, you're setting a story in Dickensian London, apparently. I think it's perfectly reasonable for them to have some of the most atrocious labor standards known to man. And I'm not even on the communist side of things. I think it's absolutely horrible some of the things they got up to, and sometimes they were even and clip this on YouTube. They were even right to unionize sometimes. I like having beef I can eat without fear of parasites or human fingers in the sausages. Uh, so it's like, yeah, I dig it. So how Dickensian is your London?
Um, I don't spend a whole lot of time in London.
Yeah,
By
of
the end of
course.
the first chapter, he's basically out of there. And so the first chapter is in London. The last chapter is in London. Interestingly enough, I kind of purposefully wrote it so that while you're in, at least in the first chapter, it's a little more formal. It's feeling kind of like that English. Um, I don't want to say genteel because they're not genteel. They're not upper class. They're not dock workers. They're the clerks and the governesses and the tradesmen and things like that. But
Right.
they do speak in a fairly formal manner, and the prose is relatively formal. And then when they leave London and they get among sailors, and then they get into the narrow world, then things kind of loosen up a little bit, and the prose is a little looser, and the conversations are a little less formal and things like that.
Of
Um,
course.
there's a lot of relatively, I shouldn't say relatively, there's a lot of stuff that is strictly accurate. So if you were to go to a map of London and figure out where the Barings house, which is where Rebecca works, where the story starts, and then you need to get to where the colliery is, and he passes through the churchyard and he passes through the alleys. And if you look on the map, the church is exactly where it should be, and the alleys are right where they should be. And if
Nice.
you look at the conversation that's going on in the pub at the night of the first day, and they're talking about a murder that happened at Eccleston Wharf and who did the murder and how they're going to be hung for it, that actually happened. I tracked down a diary online of a
Hold on.
cholera.
Whoever's touching their mic, please stop.
That would be me. It fell over. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Uh, pray continue. You were talking about some murderers being hanged, as they
Yeah,
should.
yeah. So at the pub when Edward, he still doesn't know that he's dead yet. He's just feeling horrible, and the conversation's going around, and they're talking about a murderer there. I actually tracked down the diary online of a clerk in London at a colliery in 1846, so that I could get a fairly decent sense of what life was like for Edward in that position. And that murderer took place, and that person was the person who killed him, and they were going to hang him. So I took some trouble to try and make it um, accurate, but I don't delve into the children in the factories or anything like that, because he spends such a short period of time in London, and what's happening to him is taking up all of his attention, that he's not paying attention except
Right,
for
right.
little snippets of things that come over. I mean, he remembers um, he had visited the apothecary before the story started, so that's how he knew who the guy was and what he did. And he talks about seeing strange people from all over the empire had gathered into this apothecary shop. So you get a little bit of the broader society, but only as it overlaps with Edward.
To be sure. And you mentioned the siren. Without giving away too much, it sounds like you're taking from mainly European myths and legends to create your narrow world.
Generally speaking, yes. Not everything, because the Zumbuism, which is what I call it, because I tracked the linguistic roots back to West Africa. Um, so there's some stuff from various parts of the British Empire, and there are international references. So when you get into the narrow world, because the narrow world is only half in the real world and half in this magical world, it is accessible from anywhere on the
Mm-hmm.
globe. And so when he gets there, there's a Chinese junk that is there for trading, and there are references to travelers from India who have visited the narrow world in the past. Uh, but as far as Edward is concerned, most of the folklore, like pixies, don't form into it, but he mentions offhand like pixies, and the response is, yeah, pixies are extinct because they're troublesome pests and that sort of thing. So Edward is coming from England, and much of his experiences and his familiarity are with things that are from either England or from northern Europe. And most of the things that people will encounter if they journey with Edward are either things that they will be familiar with, but with a slightly different take on them, or things that I made up to kind of spice things up. So if you run into a vampire, you'll recognize the vampire. You won't need me to tell you about what a vampire is.
Of course.
The vampire might not have the exact characteristics as, Vlad Tepes or anything like that, but it will be recognizable as a vampire. When Edward runs into the fumarole fish, I need to take a break and say, Haya, our guide, you know the narrow world. Will you please tell Edward what this fish is? And then she'll explain it to Edward, and the reader will find out that this is actually like a giant jellyfish, which will grab onto you with its tentacles, and then because it's semi-magical, it will cook its prey right there.
Huh.
And you probably don't want to get entangled with one of these things. So that's not something that I took from folklore. So you will see a mixture of both the familiar and the unfamiliar.
Well, that's pretty interesting. I do like that sort of creativity and the bringing of your own. So is it was the fumarole fish something new made for this? Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Yes, I like that bit of creativity. Gives it a nice spark to it. Uh, hmm. Very good. I always view Vlad Tepes as a trendsetter among vampires rather than the real vampire. Capes and cloaks and accents and so on. They're just copying the best.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
swag.
Uncle Baldwin's a little different. He's another one. Every author has characters that you like, and actually, Bad Case of Dead is filled with characters that I just think are they're just kind of fun. And in some ways, you could look at them as kind of wild, and maybe Anthony, you would think that this is funny because it is a unique character who has personality quirks. Um, and in a greater sense, maybe they are kind of amusing to be there, even though their role isn't particularly amusing. And Uncle Baldwin is one of those. He's a vampire, but he doesn't act like you would expect vampires to act. Um, but then if you stop and think about it, maybe he does. I mean, who knows? So
Right.
Well, yeah, I guess the question then becomes, well, how are you expecting a vampire to act?
well, right, and that's one of the things. I mean, you get. I mean, some of the things like zombies once they progress far enough down their dead, they act exactly how you would expect them to act. They're always like brains, they want to kill something and eat it, and that's all they think about. And they're not even really thinking about that; they're just reacting.
That is a mood. Literally
Right.
me.
Mm.
and in that sense that it's familiar, um, and it's in our world, so it should be familiar. But at the same time, the narrow world isn't in our world, so I felt it gave me enough latitude so that I could do the familiar but different sort of thing. Is you expect a vampire to be this way, and to a certain extent they are vampires. They do need to drink blood to survive. That hasn't changed. But if you expect them to be whatever it is that you're putting in here, and I hesitate to put too much detail because then I'm telling you what it's not or what it is or something like that, and I'd rather you buy the book to find out.
Right.
But it gives me some latitude to try and make it again the familiar but different. That it's like, yes, I recognize the vampire, but this isn't exactly like any vampire I've ever seen before.
Right. And there's,
Yeah,
we're not looking to read the same thing over and over again.
right. And
So it's all good to me.
Well, As I'm thinking this over, there's something to the idea. If you're an intelligent creature like a vampire, as opposed to what is essentially an animal, which is a zombie, right? Like they're not intelligent creatures. They're essentially they're like on the level of acting on instinct. They're beasts, you know.
Right.
Uh, so when you have an intelligent creature like a vampire, then in theory their behavior would change based on circumstance, right?
Right.
Uh, depending on where they are and what's going on around them, they have a specific thing that they are trying to get that might not work. Like if you had a vampire that acted like Vlad Tepes or the or Dracula, I should say, really in the book of the same name, and he was not in a situation that was remotely like the situation that Dracula was actually in, then you wouldn't really expect him to be a very successful vampire,
Right.
right?
Right.
A good vampire will change his behavior depending on the circumstances in order to get what he wants.
Well, and part of it'll come down to, I mean, you're hitting it right on the head. Is if this is a, a sentient creature, this is something that thinks logically and independently for itself, is very different from that beast of a zombie that's running around. And Uncle Baldwin will be happy to tell you, repeatedly if you give him the chance, that the vampires are the highest of the not dead. And so that brings the question is like, okay, so what remains of what was there before the vampire? Because you would expect if I turned into a vampire, I would be a very different vampire than if you turned into a vampire. So part of the questions that, I'm building off of is, unless Uncle Baldwin was born a vampire, which he was not, how much of Uncle Baldwin is the same as before he became a vampire? And how did becoming a vampire change that? So how does that create the situation that he's in now? And so you have a real individual taking the role of being a vampire, as opposed to being a vampire is the only and primary driving force of his existence.
Right.
So I have a question. You watch any anime, and there's a thread. I'm gonna come around and bring it to the topic. I promise. Have you ever
Okay.
watched any anime?
I've a limited amount. I very much enjoy Cowboy Bebop. I think they did a
I see.
fantastic job with that one. One
That is
Piece,
a great show.
but in general, I'd say a limited.
Limited amount. Okay, that's fine. The reason I'm going to bring this up, so there's a show which is a comedy show. Ben and I have discussed it on over in the past many times. Konosuba, uh, absolutely fantastic show, very R-rated. Would not recommend to anybody like honestly below maybe teenage years. And it is certainly not a family friendly show, but it is very, very funny. Uh, the reason I bring up Konosuba is that one of the most interesting things about Konosuba is the way that they play with their world building and your expectations with the world building, both for comedy, but also in ways that sort of make sense. So
Mhm.
here's one example that always comes up, and it's in what many people, including myself, consider to be the best episode of the show, by the way. So you know the myth of the or myth, I don't know if you would even call it a myth, the legend something of the succubus, right? Which is a normally female demon that like feeds off sleeping men and generally is connected in some way to like sexual energy. Something
Mhm.
like that. Well, in Konosuba, the succubi, instead of being like enemies of mankind who they need to fight, they realize that they could get as much energy as they would ever need if they start a service where, in exchange for just a small bit of life force, they will come into your dreams and give you the sexual fantasy that you're looking for. Uh, and this is the sort of thing that what you're describing of like, tailoring things to the logic of the world. That is first off, that idea in Konosuba is a fantastic comedic idea. It's very funny. Uh,
Mhm.
but it's also just like even on a base level, and this is what you get when you have a good parody will be like this, right? It's really clever. because it does kind of make sense, right? Like,
Right.
why would we fight with everyone if people will just give us their energy, and then we can live a mutually beneficial relationship? And you go, okay, but demons wouldn't do that. Well, no, you're right. If
But
you
but
really
it's
want to, but
yeah.
it sort of makes sense if you're building a world.
Yep.
Konosuba will do things like that. They'll have ideas that are twisted in a very clever way where it's very funny and it's not what you expect, but it also kind of makes sense.
Right. And it's taking something that's familiar and introducing something new. It's turning it a little bit sideways and making something that's familiar but also different at the same
Netflix has gone too far. Your sleep paralysis demon now has a premium subscription.
time. Yeah, you need to
Caitlin
sleep with
says,
your
I thought
credit
you.
card under the pillow.
I'm sorry, I'm reading the comments, and Caitlin goes, I thought you were going to say me, like I shouldn't watch Konosuba, so I'm cautious of what I watch and listen to. If you are prone, if you think that watching it will tempt you to sin, then don't. That is as a Catholic, that is my professional recommendation. Uh,
What's up, Merg?
However, and certainly you would, yeah. I think the show is very funny, but in certain doses, right? The succubus. To be fair, too, the succubus joke, I would say, is among the most or X-rated that they do. Maybe not the most, but certainly among the
It's
most.
barely
Like, it doesn't
PG
get much.
13. All right, it's barely PG
Yeah,
13.
yeah, I would
It's
say.
all
PG.
implications. Look,
Yes,
some of these kids are reading like Ben Franklin's journals, and then it's like, oh, I don't know about what they want to watch on TV, and it's like, no, it's too late. They looked into the mind of
that's
Ben Franklin.
fantastic because that's a joke that I get and maybe Jim gets, but I bet you half our audience does not
Well, they
get.
haven't read Ben Franklin's journals.
Yes.
They really shouldn't.
No, you really shouldn't. Talk about R-rated. Talk about X-rated. But yeah. Point is,
Yep, he accidentally muted himself.
He did accidentally mute
yeah,
himself.
my microphone came unhooked a second ago. I'm back. I'm back.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I did not bring it up for the X-rated joke. I brought it up for the world building idea,
yeah.
and I'll use a more as a sort of olive branch to all of our listeners. I'll use a more PG example of uh, something that they do. So, at one point, there is a town of mages in the world. Now, this is a world of isekai characters, right? So many, not everybody there, but many of the people who came to this world were transported from another world, right? Uh, well, there is a village in this world which is full of like mages and magic users, and it's known for being very intense. And they have a reveal in one of the movies that the reason that they are the magic users of this world is that the people who founded this town, and by the way, this is now like generations down the line, so they actually don't remember this. Like, they have to find this in the archives, right? Like the story of the founding of the town. They learned that they were actually all like edgy cosplayers from Japan who showed up in the world and were super psyched that they got to use actual magic. And so they made their entire identity like uh super intense wizard stuff. And then that just became over the generations, that just became like the town culture. Now, is this very silly and very funny? Yes. Does it also actually kind of make sense? Also, yes. Like, that is the sort of thing I would kind of expect to form in a town where people are regularly transported in from another place. And
Chinio
like you would,
weebs.
yeah, exactly. Like, it does kind of make sense. So there you go. There is a more PG example of the sort of phenomenon I'm talking about. And
Yeah.
Merg Magalramaxis, hi, welcome, says, I remember Bradford speaking against Joseph Campbell's hero's journey as the one true plot years ago. What's the OG superversive pulp rev argument against the hero's journey? Ben, I've been summoned. Uh, got curious, both because of how
Let's
highly
hear our
Professor
guest
B.
opinions first.
I know I promise I won't dominate it, but relies on hero's journey because of how destructive the influence of John A. Campbell and arguably Hugo Gernsback has been, as J.D. Cohen saw. Uh,
When
okay,
has Gernsback been
so
described as destructive?
what's up?
This is the first time I've heard of
Oh,
Gernsback being
I've
destructive.
heard it.
Huh.
I've heard it, but then I've been kind of on the edges of interacting with this world for the pulp rev world for a while. But okay, so the hero's journey. Let me go. I'll go quick to give Jim time to speak on it. But this
You
is
don't
my
have a
problem with
choice, Jim.
yeah, you have no choice. Uh, this is my problem with the hero's journey, and to be fair, I got this largely from John C. Wright, who is, as far as I know, the first person who in the pulp rev kind of community, he's not really in the middle of it, but he's on the edges of it, who has spoken out about this, the author John C. Wright. uh my problem with the hero's journey is fundamentally it doesn't exist, and what I mean is Joseph Campbell's hero's journey purports to be just not like not a plot structure that Joseph Campbell came up with, nor even a plot structure that is commonly used, but rather the ever recurring cyclical plot structure seen in all myths throughout the globe that Joseph Campbell just compiled and put together. The problem with this is it's not true, right? If you actually read Joseph Campbell's full hero's journey, it is very long, very convoluted, and almost no story has every single piece of it. Like, literally, the most stereotypical hero's journey stories you have ever read. Star Wars, for example. Star Wars is a great example to pick on, actually, because George Lucas claimed, and I believe he was lying, but he claimed that he was writing Star Wars based off of Campbell's hero's journey. The problem is, he was only taking bits and pieces of the hero's journey. He wasn't using the entire hero's journey because nobody ever uses the entire hero's journey. There's meeting with the mentor. I don't have the list in front of me, so I'm not going to take the time to pull it up and let before I let Jim speak. But maybe while he's speaking, I'll pull it up in the background. But the actual hero's journey is so long that basically, in order to fit every myth into the hero's journey, you need to lie. You need to lie, right? You need to squeeze and squeeze and go, oh, this story fits the hero's journey. If you squint, sure, you got to take out 10 of the 40 steps of the journey or 20 of the 40 steps of the journey, but it fits another 20. And sure, you got to take out another 20 steps in this story, which is completely unrelated and a completely different type of story, but it does contain a lot of steps of the very detailed hero's journey. So both of them, and then Joseph Campbell will claim that both of them fit the hero's journey. That's not how it works. Think of as the hero's journey is just basic storytelling principles that anybody would rediscover over time as they try to craft a good story. It's not how myths and legends work, right? And I do think that on a base level, the hero's journey can work. Like as a story structure. The very basic version of it. Star Wars is a basic hero's journey, uh, but it's a very basic version of it, right? Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with that as long as you acknowledge that, number one, it's not like the primeval plot structure that undergirds all fiction or mythology. And number two, when you realize that's one plot structure among several that could work, right? And that you really shouldn't be forcing your stories to fit into that specific of a mold if you don't have to. Like, there's no reason to. It's not going to hurt your story if you deviate from it a bit. Jim, what are your thoughts on this?
Sure, I'll go with that. But no, you said a couple things that I find kind of interesting. Not to argue, but just sort of to start there and move off in sort of my own direction a little bit. When you talked about recreating stories being told everywhere and you rediscovering stories and that sort of thing, it reminded me, my daughter is she's getting a PhD in nautical archaeology, which means she's taking a bunch of archaeology courses, and they're learning about different styles and developments around the world.
That's pretty cool.
And
it is.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear what she brings home and tells me about. But one of the things which is relevant here is there are people who will say the pyramids were evidence of alien life coming down and teaching ancient people building techniques, because you have pyramids all over the world, in South America, in the Middle East, in the Far East, and you couldn't possibly have pyramids all over the world if unless there was some sort of outside interference on it. And of course, as an archaeologist, she's just kind of like rolling her eyes and saying, or it could just be the most pile rock.
You got cut
And
off
you
for a
know, the
moment
hero
there.
journey might
The most
be
efficient
a
way to
very
pile
efficient
a
way
bunch
to
of
the
rocks.
story.
I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Can
You
you
can.
hear us? Yes.
Okay. Not. Yes, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. Um, I'm not sure what part you missed. I was
Let's
um,
you mentioned the pyramids
talking
as
about my daughter and
So what I missed? You mentioned that your daughter saw
that's
something, and then that's where I got lost because that's where you started cutting off.
okay. Okay, okay. So with the pyramids and people talking about how the pyramids are clear sign of alien intervention, and my daughter is like, or the pyramid structure could be the most efficient way of piling rocks. And so it could be that the hero's journey is the most efficient and engaging way to tell a progressive story, which is essentially a quest oriented story or an adventure story. And if you're going to have a story like that, people are going to fall into these natural patterns of starting off unable to accomplish your goals, overcoming the obstacles and achieving the ability to accomplish your goals, and then actually going out and overcoming those obstacles and accomplishing your goals.
right.
It's not that it's a bad way of doing things, but he might be reading more into it than say that it science of storytelling is the hero's quest. And to me, it's more of, I mean, it feels like it's a great framework. It does not have to be the only framework, and it doesn't have to be exclusive to every story, but it's kind of a great bones that you can then hang a story on, and you can fill it
Yeah.
out however you want. And whatever you dress it up with is entirely different from story to story. And my bottom line, and I haven't been shy of saying this in the past, is I believe that the story is everything,
Of
and
course.
stories are human interest stories. So I can create a fascinating world, but a fascinating world's not a story, and I can have a great goal, but a goal is not a story. A story is the way those worlds and goals interact with the characters and the people, and they humanize them and they readers. Um, and the hero's journey can either be helpful or hurtful, depending on if it's serving the story or if you're trying to take your story and force it onto the hero's journey. Um, and if somebody has a great story and they try and force it into a framework that's not appropriate for the story they're telling, then whether it's the hero's journey or any other structure, it's doing more harm than good.
Of course. I
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
yeah.
Go ahead, Ben.
I agree with you. I think that quite a few of the stories, uh, when people think about it or talk about it, well, they miss the purpose, first of all, that uh, this stuff was written during a time of, everyone's always trying to, what was trying to put everything in its own little uh, cage and stuff like that. Make a science of it, including good story writing. And his book was very successful, not necessarily because everyone was following it, but because he was able to describe more or less what everyone saw. Um, like you said, yeah. Uh, I'll just agree. Yeah, that's it. I'm being an agreeable Albert. Uh,
Yeah.
we also have a few mistakes where people think that just because it's like TV tropes, like just because you know that TV tropes exist, doesn't mean you need to follow the TV tropes. It's just a salad that you can pick things from, a buffet, not necessarily actually how you should structure a full course meal. Uh,
I found, by the
Yeah.
way, the
But
John C. Wright article that where he insults the hero's journey. I linked it in the live chat and on our private chat and our conversation on the side here. Uh, and this is John. This is what John C. Wright has to say about it. And I'm not going to quote the whole thing. 'Cause it's a fairly long article, but I'm going to quote one line because it's roughly what I was trying to say. Only John C. Wright's the one saying it, so it's better. Uh, he says, please note, if read in a sufficiently, the problem is that every story could be tortured into the hero's journey. Please note that, if read in a sufficiently loose way, these steps are not any particular portrayal of human psychology. They are the rising action, climax, and falling action of any drama. Joseph Campbell's effort is the same as the attempt made by Robert Graves in The White Goddess to torture everything from astrology to alphabetic writing into the byproducts of an alleged primordial matriarchal religion for which there is simply zero anthropological proof. So, yep, there you go. Uh, and that's exactly what I think. And then, as he points out, you can match up things like Jonah and Odysseus to Joseph Campbell's story wheel, but then there are problems because the they deviate at certain points, and Campbell would say something like, oh well, they don't need to follow every point of the wheel, but then you start to get to like, okay, but in what sense then is the wheel representing anything that's actually like in the full human psyche, right? Like, it's not a real thing, you just made it up. uh
right.
and that's the problem. And again, like, if you want to say the hero's journey is about somebody who starts at home, gets a call to adventure, goes out, and then returns, right? Which, by the way, there aren't really that many stories that are like that.
you
Like
kidding?
the Lord of
That
the
was
Rings and
basically every Lord of the Rings knockoff that's ever been.
yeah,
Uh,
but they were knockoffs of the Lord of the Ring. What I mean is, like, think of Star Wars. Luke doesn't actually return home at the end of Return of the Jedi, is what I'm saying.
yeah,
Like, you'll find things with a lot of similarities, but then you go, oh, wait a minute, that actually doesn't match, right? Like, if
sure,
Star Wars was meant to be, the hero's journey, then you go, like, well, then wait a minute, that's not the hero's journey because you're supposed to return home changed at the end of the hero's journey. And Luke doesn't return home. In fact, it gets even worse when you learn about the original draft of the Return of the Jedi, which was actually structured like a Western, where Luke left and like sailed into the sunset and Han died, right? Which is really not at all like the hero's journey. Uh, and then Lucas changed it because he was tired of the story and didn't really and just wanted to get it over with, right? But my point being that the hero's journey is just not. It can be used if you so choose to structure your story, like, because there are things in it that work dramatically, as John points out, that they're just the climax, rising action, falling action of a typical plot. But even that, when you go into plot structures, you have to remember that there isn't one type of plot structure. What John is describing in that, or John, Mr. Wright, I should say, is describing there is Freytag's pyramid, right? That's the famous one that you get in grade school, although most teachers and people won't know what it is. But that's what it is. It's Freytag's pyramid.
do you
And it
mean the
is
Maslow
actually
hierarchy of needs?
no, Maslow hierarchy of needs is completely different.
Uh, I
That's
want, I want,
Maslow's. Go ahead, finish your thought.
I have no idea what Freetag's pyramid is.
Freytag's pyramid is introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution.
Oh, okay,
Right?
yeah,
That's the Freytag's pyramid. It's sometimes just called the 5-act plot structure. It's actually Freytag's pyramid. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is an entirely different concept. But yeah, Freytag's pyramid. The problem with Freytag's pyramid, there isn't a problem with it. It's perfectly fine for what it is. The thing is, though, it was not meant to apply to every story. It was actually designed specifically for tragedies, and specifically dramatic tragedies, as in plays, tragic plays, right? Freytag's pyramid was actually meant to apply to a tragic play. When you go into what is the earliest plot structure that we have on record that is a full plot structure, well, it actually comes from Aristotle. And Aristotle had a much simpler plot structure. He broke stories into beginning, middle, and end. Uh, like, that's the first plot structure.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I do.
Go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in, and I was going to say one thing that I do think is useful for Campbell's hero journey. Not that it should be taken as a blueprint for anybody's story per se, because I think the story trumps anything else. But like any other tool in the toolbox, is if you familiarize yourself with it and you recognize where it manifests in other people's work, then you become more of a craftsman because you can make it serve your needs. And this is kind of getting back to if you take a story and you force it to conform with the hero's journey, then you're making it all about the hero's journey and less about your story.
Yeah.
But you can't take the hero's journey and make it serve your story if you don't know what the hero's journey is or any of the other ways of writing. And in that regards, I think it's useful for authors, maybe not to like read the whole book, but at least familiarize themselves with the major concepts and how they apply and how they've been used.
Yeah. If only for creativity's sake. You can't use what you don't know, as you said.
Exactly.
It's oh yeah. Like I do believe authors should study, and not just by reading, but also reading critical and analytical work. The question is, of course, how to separate yourself from the critical work, because otherwise you're just kind of looking for reviews and never actually thinking about your work.
Right. And
Which is,
there's a ton of authors out there that they write a first book and you read it and it's just like it's amazing. It just
sure.
blows you away. It's the
Aragon.
best thing ever. Yeah. And then they write another book and it's crap. And then they write a third book and it's crap. And you realize that they don't know actually how to write. They have a good story and they got lucky the first time, but they don't actually know the craft of writing and how to present it. And without knowing the craft, if you don't get lucky, it doesn't work for you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the craft is what takes the time to put in to learn, the turns of phrases and the changing of the scenes and, why does this scene work and this scene doesn't, and what it means to carry momentum forward through the story and the ticking clock and all the other elements and where you shouldn't use them. And, if you're how to invert something like this is the rule, you need to know the rule before you can break it, sort of thing.
Yep.
Yeah, and there's somebody I'm looking through. So the link to the article that Mr. Wright had. Need to be careful because he's not John, he's Mr. Wright. That Mr. Wright had, and as I'm looking through it, somebody mentioned, and they reminded me of this that so if you've ever heard of Dan Harmon, he's one of the creators of Rick and Morty, right, which is adult cartoon.
Yep.
It is a nasty little show. I think it can be very funny at times, but it's also a hard show to actually recommend, if that makes sense, right?
Mhm.
Like, I probably like more of it than I dislike overall, just because it has some very clever sci-fi ideas and some of the jokes really land. But I find it hard to go like, oh man, you should watch this show. It will make your life better. And going, well, no, right? You get what I mean. But Dan Harmon has something called the story circle that he uses for Rick and Morty, which is like a stripped down version of the hero's journey that he adapted for TV. And it's fascinating because much like J.J. Abrams' mystery box. So, J.J. Abrams, Ben and I discussed this, I think, even just last week or a couple weeks ago. There's a fascinating TED Talk that I highly recommend everyone watch if they are curious about what's going on with like J.J. Abrams film. Like, if you're curious about how does J.J. Abrams keep getting away with making incredibly vapid films that make millions and millions of dollars, right? The Mystery Box TED Talk is like a peek behind the curtain, and it is fascinating, right? I highly recommend it. Basically, he says that it doesn't really, according to J.J. Abrams, it doesn't actually matter what the solution to a mystery is. What you need to do is introduce a mystery that the characters are trying to solve and then set up clues that look like they're going to lead somewhere. And then it doesn't really matter where they actually lead because the audience is already hooked, right? Like, which is, I think, awful writing, but fascinating, right? Like,
Yes.
just really, really an interesting philosophy of writing.
Practically immoral.
Well,
Yeah.
the fact that he keeps making these movies that make so many millions of dollars suggests that he's onto something, though.
So what he's
Whether we
onto,
like it or not, he's successful in doing it.
so he's successful. The what he's onto is the fact that he's absolutely right that having a mystery set up is compelling. It's compelling enough, but I think it gets to why we, the people, like there is a tendency that I certainly experience, and I know other people have, some of whom won't even admit it because I don't want to admit that they've been tricked. But I don't have any pride. I'm happy to admit I've been tricked by J.J. Abrams movies in the past. Uh, right? Who watch a J.J. Abrams film, like it, then rewatch it and go, wow, there is really nothing at all here. How did I like this? And that's why. It's because as you were watching it, the mystery that he was setting up was very, very interesting. And then he didn't actually solve it, right? Star Trek Into Darkness, The Force Awakens is a brilliant example of this. Infamously, the Star Wars sequel trilogy had no plan, right? Like they had no idea what they were doing. J.J. Abrams sets up many plot threads in The Force Awakens, none of which go anywhere, right? Now, George Lucas, when he wrote the original Star Wars, also did not have a long term plan for the series, but there is a big difference. He intended the original Star Wars to be able to stand on its own, and it does, right? Like it would work, it works very well as a standalone movie. Every major plot thread is set up and resolved in that film, but with enough things, if you wanted to make a sequel, you could. That's not how J.J. Abrams does it, right? He sets up intentionally dangling plot threads, but doesn't actually have a plan as to how to resolve them, which makes it very compelling to watch in the moment, but inevitably you're going to be disappointed, right? Well, Dan Harmon has something in Rick and Morty that he uses called the story circle. Rick and Morty is a show that can occasionally get very meta, right? And really likes to talk about itself. I actually had an episode where they literally like go on a train and the train represents the different stages of the story circle. So this is very
Ah,
very public. And the way he says it is in my version of the hero's journey, which is adapted for a weekly TV show, the protagonist is in a zone of comfort, desires something, enters an unfamiliar situation, adapts to the situation, gets what he desired, pays a heavy price for winning, returns to his familiar situation, and has changed overall. Now, this on its face is not a bad idea for a story structure, right? Like there's some drama there and things like that. And you can in fact fit Rick and Morty into the structure very well. Now the reason you can fit most of Rick and Morty into the structure very well is that Dan Harmon has openly admitted that he is writing with the structure in mind. However, what you'll notice if you pay close attention is that there's a lot of cynicism here because Harmon has admitted and has been very public about this. He is intentionally writing these episodes in such a way that nothing substantial actually changes every week, right? He wants to make it so that every week when you watch a new episode, everything is you are essentially you're still watching like the same show. Like you haven't actually seen real progression. And in fact, that's one of the big criticisms of Rick and Morty over the years, is that Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland, who is the other showrunner, they like to fake progression, right? They really
Justin
like to make it
Roiland isn't really around anymore.
Yeah, he stopped. He left due to
Yeah.
allegations that may or may not be true. None of this matters. But it was Roiland and Harmon. Now it's just Harmon, really. But like, the point is that the one thing that the show can, I think, fairly be criticized for is that it likes to fake progression from the characters. The characters progress very, very slowly, if at all, but they look like they are moving a lot more than they are. And then this has a tendency to get very frustrating, where you're expecting somebody to act differently, like this far into the show, and they just don't. Rick is the biggest offender of this, of course, where you would expect Rick to either turn into some sort of better person by now, or worse person even, and he's just kind of the same. Uh, because they can't change Rick, because that might get people to stop watching the show. This is one of the reasons that Breaking Bad became so big the year that it came out. Breaking Bad was like right in the middle of the era of prestige TV, and in some ways represented the pinnacle of it. But if you read the creators of Breaking Bad, they're actually very open about the fact that one of their big, like, writing narrative goals of Breaking Bad was that nothing was sacred, right? Anything can happen any week, and there would be real lasting consequences for it, right? Like, if the characters killed someone, this would have been then this is a big deal. It affects the rest of the show. People figure out Walter's identity at various points, that he's a drug dealer, that he's not. Things are constantly changing. Characters die, characters' circumstances change constantly, right? That's that's what made Breaking Bad so interesting, because TV writing had stagnated. It had stagnated in a big way, where characters either didn't evolve or evolved extremely slowly. And while sometimes that's okay, depending on the type of show that you have, I think when you design things with this idea in mind of nothing will change, it gets frustrating. You see this with MASH, right, which ran forever. And whether or not characters changed, or the situation changed at all, or they actually developed, basically depended on whatever the writers want to do in a particular week. Now, I've liked episodes of MASH that I've seen. I'm not a huge MASH fan, but it can be funny. But there is a certain frustration in watching these older, long running shows and going, why does nothing ever change, ever?
Nothing ever happens. Uh, I'm trying to untangle the threads back.
Trying to get back to where we started.
Yeah.
Oh no, you've gotten lost in the tangle, Ben.
No, I'm trying to make it coherent. Uh, so, all right, I gotcha. So John Campbell's ghost actually shows up as a character in Rick and Morty, and it's incredibly funny because this author pulls out the most
It is.
absolutely terrible idea you can possibly imagine, where he's like, "Wait, what if I'm an author and I have a pen and anything I write happens?" Yeah, and his ghost is John Campbell's ghost is like shaking his head, waving his arms, going, "No, no, no, no." It's terrible. Uh, I like to think that we are better than that hack, and certainly the hacks at Rick and Morty and other places like that. Uh, we are over an hour in. Let us forcibly derail the subject and head to the Kickstarter, where we'll discuss some of your rewards and stuff. This trolley derailment was not done for a philosophical problem. There were no survivors on principle. Um, survivors will be. This train will be
We went
derailed,
back.
and survivors will
Yeah,
be derailed again.
yeah. Anyone who survived, we went back for them in this trolley problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have three different support tiers: ebook, paperback and hardcover. I can certainly vouch for the hardcover quality that Kursova has put out. Sure, they are no leather-bound goatskin, hand-raised by Owen Benjamin himself, but they are quite good, and they look handsome on the shelf, which is what is most important in a hardcover. Uh, there's also some add-ons, and Mr. Breyfogle, would you be happy to talk to us about these add-ons?
Sure. The add-ons and we purposefully kept the campaign clean, so there's not a whole lot of add-ons to choose from, but they are the Paths of Core Manor, which came up earlier. That's a standalone novel and kind of harkens back to a world of Norse mythology, kind of a post Ragnarok. I don't want to digress too much into it. I enjoyed writing it. It has pretty good reviews. It can be added on if you want to when you support Bad Case of Dead. There's the Mongoose and Meerkat, volumes 1 through 3. Those are the series of short stories that when you put together, you have a longer story arc.
Mm-hmm.
They were originally published in Kursova magazine, and then they came out as 3 volumes. You can add those on, or you can get the Mongoose and Meerkat Volume 1 audiobook, and we were talking about it a little bit before the show started. It is it is a great audio version of Mongoose Meerkat Pursuit Without Asking, which is volume number 1. The woman who read it did a fantastic job of reading the story. She really nailed Kat's voice. She did a great job with the free story that was included in that volume. A little bit of a kind of a forewarning is it is the only one of the Mongoose and Meerkats that has been turned into an audiobook at this point. I don't mean for that to discourage anybody, because if you like listening to audiobooks, then this is absolutely one that is worth listening to. It's just that we have not made volume 2 or 3 into an audiobook yet.
Mm.
So the first 2 of those are they're pretty cheap add-ons. Paths of Core Manor is $3. Mongoose and Meerkat, all 3 volumes for $6. Those are in the digital version, and then obviously the Mongoose and Meerkat is an audiobook.
Oh yeah, and $10 is very cheap for an audiobook. I'm personally going to get that because I do not have an audiobook of Mongoose and Meerkat yet. Uh, it's very nice. Uh, Kursova is a proven brand. We here at the Superversive podcast certainly do not want to, shall we say, lead any of our dear listeners away with false promises. Um, it's quite good. And I'm looking forward to A Bad Case of Dead. Your description of it in this podcast has been excellent. And it does sound exactly like the sort of thing I enjoy. It also reminds me of what is it? It's like Super Magical Team Unicorn, the last Gendy Tartovsky show that he released on Prime, which is about this team of immortal evil fighters who are attempting to purge the world of an evil. I don't know. I think there's a trend going on or something.
Yeah. There's always somebody who's willing to fight evil in the world.
Oh yeah. It's I'm just
Yeah.
thinking of of that necromancer. It's like just sitting there in the homeowners association. Harold Doomschmidt, are you raising the dead again? No. All right. Well, the HOA says you can't have these big pits in your yard. It's
I
not what you
mean,
think.
maybe not far off. I mean, Edward's like, you got to help me. And he's like, I don't want to. So, yeah, it could be.
You're poor. Get out of my yard. I wouldn't even resurrect you for my army of the damned.
Yeah, so I got enough zombies. You can join the other ones.
You'll be all right.
Yeah, yeah,
Better conversationalist. And none of that weird, please, sir, can I have some more accent?
yeah. Yes,
Sir,
sir. May I have another?
Edward's just sitting
Yeah.
there. Can I get angry about this? Can I? Is this worth losing my temper over?
Yeah.
A question did just occur to me as we're sitting here that might be worth asking because it pertains to the writing process, which is why did you pick this specific era to set the story in? I understand, first off, there is some merit in just picking an era that isn't very common for fantasy stories just for novelty's sake. But is there anything further than that? Did you have a specific reason that you said, I want it to be this time period?
Um. So yes, no, sort of, maybe, kind of, if that makes any sense.
It
It
does.
Um.
does.
All right, we're done. Great
there
answer.
we
No,
there we
keep
go.
going.
No, I mean, I'm kind of a sucker for the Age of Sail,
Oh
and so
yes.
if you're going to go on a journey into an archipelago and then sail around this group of islands, it's way more cool and romantic if you're doing it in a sailing ship. So right off the bat, I'm pre-Age of Steam, and then sort of pieces kind of I was looking for Victorian, and of course Victorian is huge. I mean, people think of it as like 1880, but she actually took the throne well before then.
Hmm.
Um, and that was just sort of a ballpark sort of thing. And I wanted to be able to do certain things without getting too specific. But one of the skills that Edward brings from Cornwall had to be available to him. So it needed to happen after a certain point in time. So that cuts out a whole range of early options for me. Um, and then as I'm looking to try and add some of this historical authenticity, and I'm digging for sources saying, okay, if I want to be able to reference certain things that are really kind of nitty gritty and unique, what's available to me? And I mentioned earlier about this journal of a clerk in a colliery in London in 1846, and it was a fascinating read because of various things that this guy was up to that I'm pretty sure he probably didn't think anybody would be reading in his journal 170 years later. Otherwise, he wouldn't have put them in. Um, but it also gave me it gave me some um, historical events that I could include into the story, like the murder, to add authenticity to it. And I like doing that, doing things that people they might very well be made up, but they aren't. And if people recognize them as being authentic, one, they're probably really weird because they know what's going on in London in 1846. But two, it adds some sort of, I don't want to say credibility, but authenticity to the story. And kind of on a real quick aside, because I know we're an hour and 20 minutes into it or something like that. But I like spent 45 minutes on figuring out how to make bricks without clay because I knew if you needed a brick house on a tropical island, you weren't going to have clay deposits to
Yep.
make the bricks. And so 45 minutes worth of research comes up in the phrase pale yellow brick house. But if anybody does know about brick making, they will know that if you wanted to make bricks with native materials on a tropical island, you're not going to get red clay bricks because you don't have the clay that has iron or anything else in it to form it. It's going to look like something else, and it's actually going to look like kind of a cream colored brick if you're using calcium from seashells.
Yep.
Yeah, those sorts of details are always really great to include, and it's I think one of the reasons that both Ben and I love history is reading things that happened that seem like they can't possibly be true, and then it is.
And then it is, and
It's
stuff like
just a
that.
very it's a fun moment.
Yeah, and who would think to question the description of pale yellow bricks? I mean, nobody's gonna do that, but I do like to make things as authentic as possible. And a lot of the stuff, if it's not clearly fanciful, I mean, the fumarole fish does not exist in our world, and nobody should expect that it does. Um, but most of the stuff that's not
Hmm.
clearly made up is probably accurate, or it's as accurate as I could make it. Sometimes I tweak it a little bit to make it fit in, but usually it's accurate. I mean, when Edward says that he had this experience working for this guy back in Cornwall before the story even started, that guy owned the mines in Cornwall at that time. Edward could have worked for him.
Nice. I like that stuff. Uh,
Yeah,
it,
that's pretty cool.
yeah, and it does uh, become a sterling recommendation for your work for how careful you treat the source material. Uh, I'm almost scared to ask if it's a real necromancer who disappeared.
No, that one is not. The necromancer is entirely fanciful, and any resemblance to characters, living or dead, is purely coincidental.
I don't know if you saw it. I think maybe Kursova shared it, where it's a opening screen for a video game, and it goes, "Yeah, this is a work of slander. I know these people in real life. They're really at this. I am a lawyer. Come at me." Uh, all right. Yeah, no, it sounds good. It sounds like a great time. A perfect uh, amount. It sounds like we're definitely going to get our money's worth out of a Kickstarter, and it's quite reasonable goals. And like we've mentioned before, you can even get an audiobook for an extra $10, which is very tempting for me at least. Uh, Kursova is pretty much a guaranteed publish every time, and it's already doing quite well, well over halfway to its goal with 58 backers. So there's plenty of opportunities for other people as well. Uh,
Yeah.
I'm going to relink the description in the chat. Mr. Breyfogle, would you like to have any last words for us?
I can't think of anything that hasn't been already said, but I would like to thank you again for having me on and giving me a chance to talk about A Bad Case of Dead and some of the other things that I've done. So thank you for that.
Oh, absolutely. And I do look forward to your next project, even as this project has not yet reached my hands. Um, yeah, buy his books. Buy his books. Yes. Anthony, you got anything for
Paths of
us?
Cormanor was very good. I liked it.
Good.
Good,
Yes.
good, good.
All right. I'm going to let everyone go a little early tonight. I'm tired. For those who pray, do pray for my ankle. Something is happening to it. It's
Oh
turn.
dear.
Uh,
Oh
uh,
no.
I know it's the most important part of my writing process. Uh, and I hope to see you all again next week when we'll have the artist behind Princess Veronica and Bolivar and the Bears from Arkhaven Comics. Thank you all for coming and have a wonderful evening. Good night.